Hello, everybody. This is our fourth lecture. The date is July 18th, and it's a little bit after 9 in the evening. And remember, our subject matter is the nominal rate of interest and its 5 components. And in the second lecture, we talked about the pure rate of interest, which is one of the 5 components. A good estimate of it is 4 to 4.25%. And then lecture 3 was about the debtor's risk premium. And a good estimate of the debtor's risk premium for government, for US government, is about 25 basis points. And this is casual empiricism. The debtor's risk premium, when added to the pure rate of interest, gives you a rate of interest, a nominal rate of interest of 4.5%. And so we've got 3 other components to account for. And sure enough, we're going to take up the third component, which would be the inflationary or deflationary price premium. And a good estimate of this premium is roughly, I use 2.1%. You can quibble with that and say, well, heck, should be a little bit less than that, maybe 1.6 or 1.8. But whenever I went to change the estimate, the latest reading always comes in at 2 or 2.1%. So I'm going to keep the 2.1%. It is just a approximate estimate, if you will. The inflationary price premium is prevalent when there is an inflation of prices. And we can even have a deflationary price premium when prices are actually going down. And there you add a negative number to the nominal rate of interest and to the debtor's risk premium. In other words, the third component would be a deflationary price premium would be a negative number, and the first 2 are, of course, positive numbers. The pure rate of interest is always positive, and the debtor's risk premium is always there and is positive as well. So the inflationary price premium assumes an inflation, or if you have a deflationary price premium, it assumes a deflation of prices. So the good estimate I'm going to use for the inflationary price premium is 2.1%. How do we explain it? Well, it's really, the inflationary price premium is a correction mechanism. When there is an inflation of prices, credit and debtors are affected. Debtors win and creditors lose. Well, what am I saying here? Let's take it the perspective of the creditor. When let's end the $1,000 loan that I talked about it with the first component. If the $1,000 is lent to me on July 18th, today, it has a higher purchasing power than it will have on July 17th, 2021. What am I saying here? If we assume an inflation of prices, then the purchasing power of the $1,000 will decrease, and of course, the debtor, the creditor wins here because he spends the $1,000 at a time when it has more purchasing power than 1 year hence. And when the creditor is paid back the $1,000, the $1,000 has less purchasing power. It's as if it has been a silent transfer of wealth from creditor to debtor. So with an inflation of prices, the creditor loses and the debtor wins. And this also reflects on the important monetary issue of the neutrality or non-neutrality of money. And by virtue of the fact that with deferred payments, with the credit transactions, we see that money is not neutral. The purchasing power of a loan paid back has much less purchasing power than it did when it was lent out. So we say creditors lose and debtors win. Now, and just to add another idea here with the neutrality or non-neutrality of money, your professor believes that money is non-neutral. We simply casually take notice that that prices do not go up at the same time and to the same extent. So there's another reason for the non-neutrality of money. So it's a corrective mechanism. Now, if we have a deflation of prices, things are just the reverse. The borrower loses and the creditor gains. The purchasing power paid back to the creditor in a deflationary world would have more purchasing power at the end of the loan than at the beginning. And so creditors win, debtors lose when experiencing a deflation of prices. But in the actual world we live in, for decades, we have been experiencing an inflation of prices. And sometimes it has been very, very severe. And in the late 70s, prices increased significantly. And so did nominal rates of interest. The 3-month Treasury bill for 1979 fluctuated in a range of 18% to 22.5%. And most of the 18 or 22% was an inflationary price premium. And textbooks mention it was 14%, and back then it was even estimated higher. A 14% interest rate, sorry, not interest rate, but an inflationary price premium. Well, if it's added to the 4.25% pure rate estimate and the 1/4% debtor's risk premium estimate to total 4.50%, 14% added on to 4.5% gives you 18.5% interest, nominal interest. And so there you go. The attachment of the inflationary price premium can be it tries to make up for the loss in wealth of the creditor. It's a corrective mechanism. And here's where we bring in the idea of inflationary expectations. When inflation is tame, when it's 1-2% and hardly anybody's taking notice, if somebody were to ask you, what do you expect for the inflation of 2021, inflation rate, you may say, well, we'll just do a back of the envelope calculation. We'll do a 3-year average of 2018, 19, and 2021 rates of inflation to a simple average, and there's your estimate. But in the early 60s, late 60s, early 70s, inflation was gradually increasing. And anytime that people estimated by means of a 3-year average, for example, they were always wrong. They missed it by 1 or 2%. Now, the type of inflationary expectation with the back of the envelope calculation, we will name adaptive inflationary expectation. And that's the name given by the literature to this type of inflationary expectation. And it's really when inflation is tame. But if you have year in, year out, increasing inflation, and creditors begin to feel the silent transfer of wealth, then there's a corrective mechanism which arises, and that's the attachment of an inflationary price premium. And I don't know if you noticed this, but your parents and grandparents greatly fear an inflation of prices. Inflation is a dirty word to them, and they get very, very upset. Not only because of the higher rates, but if you think about it, the rate of price inflation was greater in the late 70s than the rate of increase in income, and therefore real income decreased. And we're talking about large numbers here, and people, it became a political issue. High single-digit rates, or even double-digit rates, 14% in, let's say, 1979, became a political issue. And just, for example, this was one of the major factors leading to the election of President Reagan. And he was a conservative, one of the first conservative, well, he was the first conservative elected in, oh goodness, so you have to go back to, I think, William Howard Taft in the 1912 or so. So that's what, 68 years that a conservative was not in the White House. And of course, we had the Democratic Party in the White House most of the time, and people reacted to the Great Depression, and that's why they were became the dominant party. And all, even today, most big cities have Democratic mayors, so that's an effect of the Great Depression. But the Democratic Party in late 1970s and 80s were dubbed the party of inflation, and they lost the 1980 election in part because of the high double-digit inflation experienced in 1979. So everyone, the inflationary expectations actually change when we get to high single-digit or double-digit inflation. It's not only a political issue, but inflationary expectations actually change. And they change from adaptive expectations to a new type of expectation, not new anymore. I'm sure you've heard this before in your macro courses, rational expectations. And how do we define rational? Well, it's kind of a misnomer. It can even be misleading. The idea here is that we take advantage of all the information that's available, and we're looking for a causal relationship now. We've been hit over the head with high single-digit or even double-digit rates, and then it catches our attention, and we start looking for causal relationships. We look at the money supply, for example, and other factors, and don't you see, this gives us our inflationary expectations. So here's a good, just a simple-minded example of it. If the Federal Reserve for 2020 increases the supply of money and credit 10 times what the increase was in 2019, then other things being equal, you would expect a higher rate of inflation. So if we take advantage, notice really of all the factors at work causing inflation, and then come up with an inflationary expectation, this is an example of rational expectations. So we have that as part of this, but what I want you to do, and since we don't have the handout and we don't have screen to draw a graph on right now. I want you to draw a graph, just the second quadrant of a 4-quadrant diagram, if you will, the northeast quadrant. And I want you to label the vertical axis the nominal rate of interest. And then I want you to label the horizontal axis as the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, supplied and demanded. So quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis, vertical axis, nominal rate of interest. And then put in supply curve of loanable funds and demand curve. And you have an intersection point. And that would be the nominal rate of interest. But we're going to account for inflation in this graph. And so what do? We shift the supply curve upward, and what creditors are really saying is, I'll lend out the same amount of money I lent out in the previous time period, only if I can charge a higher rate of interest. So that's what the shift means upward. It means the creditor can indeed charge a higher nominal rate of interest, if you will, by virtue of what? The inflationary price premium. So that's that. And we have maybe the Chicago school people to greatly, and Irving Fisher to thank for the idea of the inflationary price premium, but our explanation is somewhat incomplete. If you notice, when you shift the supply curve upward, directly upward in space, it intersects the demand curve at a point to the northwest of the original intersection point. And what are we saying? If you read off the horizontal axis, the amount of credit supplied and demanded, we actually see in the graph, with just the supply curve shift and only the supply curve shift, actual decrease in the amount of credit that's right off the horizontal axis. And people, I'm here to tell you that empirically, we don't observe this. So our explanation is either incomplete or incorrect. And really, we want to say that the inflationary price premium is the result of two shifts in the quantity of loanable funds graph. Not only does the supply curve shift upward, but so does the demand curve. In other words, when we just shifted the supply curve upward, we were considering the inflationary expectations of only creditors. But why be so exclusive? Debtors, borrowers form inflationary expectations as well, and a lot of other people as well, too. So I have in mind here businessmen who have machinery, let's say big ticket items, like a printing press, that is almost worn out from use, maybe 15, 20 years use. And in 3 years' time, the owner decides that he is going to buy a new printing press. But 3 years prior to when he would buy, the country is experiencing a rip-roaring double-digit inflation. And he says to himself, well, if I buy 3 years from now, well, maybe I won't be able to buy it. The price of the printing press is too high, and I'll have to contract my business or maybe even go out of business because I can't compete, not having a well-running printing press. And so he says, look, I'll go into the loanable funds market, the fixed income market, and borrow the money. And I'm willing to pay a slightly higher rate than now just to get the loan, and therefore to buy the printing press in question. So he does this, and this is represented graphically by a demand curve shift upward. And the intersection of supply and demand with the new curves doesn't give you the big change in the money supply, the amount of credit supplied doesn't decrease. and the interest rate is higher than it would be just with the one shift of the supply curve. So the difference between the new equilibrium point will say just with the supply curve shifting upward, you'll get 0.2. But with the supply and demand curve shifting upward together simultaneously, you'll get a 2 prime. And 2 prime is greater than 2 and 1 as well. So the difference between 2 prime and 1 is the inflationary price premium. It's not the nominal rate of interest 0.2 less 0.1, rather it's the nominal rate of interest 0.2, 2 prime less 0.1. So there you have it. And in other words, you have the inflationary price premium determined by 2 shifts. The more intuitive shift of the supply curve, what creditors are trying to achieve, graphically speaking, and then no use to in being too exclusive. We have to account for debtors or would-be debtors' inflationary expectations. That too shifts up, and that gives us a larger inflationary price premium than just with the supply curve shift. So there you have it. We have an inflationary price premium, and in the late 1970s, it was the most significant of the 5 factors. So I will end this lecture right now. I don't know if it's 15 or 20 minutes. It's a short lecture, but really, really important. Today, inflation is not a political issue. We don't have high single-digit or double-digit inflation. And therefore, the attachment of the inflationary price premium isn't as great as before. But a lot of people are saying, well, the rate of inflation, if we're to get to full employment output, we need a higher rate of inflation. So let's try to get it by monetary policy actions. Well, okay, you can easily manufacture an increasing inflation, but once the inflation genie is out of the bottle, it's very hard to put it back in. It took a long time, beginning with President Reagan, his administration, and other presidents, to reduce the inflationary price premium and therefore reduce nominal rates of interest. So what do I want to say here? We have 3 components that have been explained. The pure rate, which is 4.25%. The debtor's risk premium, which is 1/4 of 1%, taking the nominal rate up to 4.5%. And then we add on the inflationary price premium. And I'll use my estimate of 2.1%. So the nominal rate of interest jumps to 6.6%. And what we have to explain now is the liquidity premium, and also the 5th component, monetary policy actions of the central bank. So I thank you for your attention. And, you know, I've been thinking these lectures may be a little bit dry. I think maybe we should have a joke of the day, if at all possible. And maybe I will give you an incentive to submit them. And whoever comes up with the best one will get maybe 1 or 2 percentage more points for the total course total, and may mean a higher grade. So let me tell one. An alligator is on welfare. What does the alligator receive? Well, he receives Gator Aid. Ha ha ha. So anyway, please think of some jokes to send in by email, and I might surprise you using that joke, and of course giving you credit for the joke and question. So thank you very much. And I will end the lecture right now.